Hello everyone, this is Chris here with another edition of Philosopher's Ideas between 10 minutes and 10 hours. The philosopher and psychologist William James is probably best known for his philosophical theory of pragmatism. However, he was also a defender of religious faith, and he did not consider his respect for science to be something to preclude him from his faith. In his 1896 speech under the title of The Will to Believe, he directly takes on the task of refuting the idea that we should not accept a belief based on insufficient evidence. He will argue instead that, however rational such an idea may seem in the sciences, what he calls the religious hypothesis puts us in a situation where religious faith is rational thinking. What James puts forth takes the form of a kind of intellectual gambit. Recognizing that he is not the first to take this approach, he talks about a previous argument known as Pascal's wager. Blaise Pascal likewise did not propose that his wager constituted proof of the existence of God, but seeks to motivate it instead by asking what would happen if we have a mistaken belief one way or the other. If we believe that God is, when in fact God is not, there is no harm done. But if we believe that God is not, when in fact God is, well, we all know the consequences. Pascal also wrote it in terms of belief that God is not, leading people to act as if God is not, which is a point I will get to later. Apart from the issue of the threat itself being something that the skeptic would also be skeptical about, James also sees a problem with the idea in general of deciding to believe something. If to believe something is to think that it is factually true independent of whether we believe it or not, how is it possible that we can just decide, without being intellectually convinced, to believe something that we do not already believe? James says that Pascal's own belief must surely have come from other springs. Despite this apparent difficulty, he will argue that Pascal's wager is actually a clincher. James starts off with three questions about options we may face regarding any hypothesis that may be proposed to our belief. An option may be living or dead, forced or avoidable, and momentous or trivial. Whether an option is living or dead is a question of whether both alternatives are live for us. Being an agnostic or a Christian, he says, is for us a live option. A choice between being a theosophist or a Mohammedan is dead, because neither hypothesis is live for us. Here James is reckoning that an option to be living for us must be alive in the sense that it is part of a cultural possibility, rather than simply a purely intellectual possibility. For those of us who are not Arabs, he says, if I ask you to believe in the Mahdi, the notion makes no electric connection with your nature. The second question of an option is whether it is forced or avoidable. Choosing to go out with or without an umbrella is not a forced option because we can choose not to go out at all. Loving or hating someone, or calling a theory true or false, are also not forced because one may be indifferent or choose not to judge. To be forced, we must have no possibility of not choosing one of the terms and not both of a disjunction, a statement of this or that. James says that an option of accept this truth or go without it is of this type. Thirdly, we have the question of whether an option is momentous. If given a chance to go on a North Pole expedition, the option would be momentous because it may be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to secure a kind of immortality in the form of fame and glory. Where an opportunity is not unique, the stakes insignificant, or the decision reversible, the option is trivial. Many hypotheses in science are alive but trivial, due to no harm being done if the experiments are inconclusive. In the end, James will argue that the religious hypothesis is forced and momentous for those of us who find it live. According to him, Our intellectual nature and intellectual lives will show this to be true. He starts off his analysis of this by saying that he believes it is mistaken to assume that our passions and social forces are not at work in the fixing of our opinions. If one assumes that intellectual insight and pure reason is what settles opinion, that assumption just flies in the face of the facts. It is instead an intellectual climate that makes hypotheses possible or impossible, alive or dead for us. We believe in democracy and conservation of energy for worthy reasons, but with no more insight than the disbeliever may possess. According to James, there is a prestige of opinion that he says makes the spark shoot from them and light up our sleeping magazines of faith. Our faith ends up being faith in someone else's faith and in the greatest matters. Our reason ends up being satisfied with just a few arguments for any critic that may come along. Our social system ends up being what supports the very idea that there is a truth. James says that as this happens, it continually puts us in a better position toward truth. This also refers to his meaning of pragmatism as a criterion of truth, that the true idea is the useful one, or one that he says has a cash value in experimental terms. If I am lost in the woods and I believe I should follow that path, I may find it leading me to a house where I might find people who help me. If I take a trip to Japan, I assume Japan to actually exist, under the presumption of it being highly unlikely that everyone else lies or is mistaken about its existence. When it works out well for me, I effectively call these things true. And so another way of explaining pragmatism is that what it means to believe something is to take a risk on it. I believe something when I hang my hat on it. Here James says we generally disbelieve that of which we have no use. As a result of this, our hopes, prejudices, passions, instincts, fears will also be at the roots of our system of beliefs. This is true even in the sciences, where, for instance, few will even look for evidence of telepathy. If that were real, it would undo the uniformity of nature. And so James says he was once told by a biologist that if telepathy were true, scientists ought to band together to keep it suppressed and concealed. According to James, it is because scientists are not finding something they can do with telepathy. James does not regard these tendencies to be reprehensible or pathological. As an admirer of the sciences, he still wishes to have empirical evidence and rational thought decide things on intellectual grounds. The problem is that when genuine options cannot be decided on intellectual grounds, our passional nature may and must decide our options between propositions. This then gives us insight into how Pascal's wager can be a clincher, where we often do in fact decide what we will believe. According to James, not only do we decide what to believe, but we also sometimes make something true by our belief of it. What he has in mind here is matters of personal relations. If he waits for evidence that his audience likes him, he will act aloof and alienate the crowd. His audience is more likely to find him likable if he were to act as if it were already true that they like him. On a larger scale, a social organization proceeds by a duty to trust that others will do their part. There is a faith in one another. Government, schools, armies, or a ship all function under this condition. By contrast, people who do not have this faith in each other do not function well collectively. And this is why a few highwaymen can rob a train while being highly outnumbered. They are united in their goal, while the passengers fear making the slightest move of resistance and being the only one to resist. If we all believed that we would all fight back, then we would. The significance of this is that there are some instances where a fact only comes by means of a pre-existing faith in its existence. A faith in a fact can help create a fact. This is true at least about our personal relations, even though in our dealings with objective nature, we are to be recorders rather than makers of truth. These considerations will point to the idea that the way to resolve the religious hypothesis may not be the same as the way to resolve questions in the empirical sciences. Before James goes directly to the issue of religious faith, he wants to distinguish between two ways of looking at our duty when it comes to matters of opinion. Is our duty that we must know the truth, or is it that we must avoid error? James says that these are two separate laws that will color our whole intellectual life. In his view, escaping from one falsehood does not guarantee that we will not step right into another. He wants to regard desire for truth as paramount and avoidance of error as secondary. He would not prefer that we believe nothing, rather than to never close the mind based on insufficient evidence. Why would he believe that? When we obey our fear of being duped, we are obeying a fear. There are worse things than being duped. To let this fear dominate us is akin to a general telling his soldiers to stay out of battle rather than to risk a single wound. But victories are not gained that way. Our feelings about truth or error are also expressions of our passional life, and part of it. In this passional life, our minds are every bit as ready to grind out falsehood. Given these considerations, a lightness of heart seems better in a world where we can be certain that error will sometimes occur anyway. In his view, we may sometimes face a situation where we must decide belief without us having sufficient evidence to prove one thing or its negation. However, if we continue to will that we must avoid error by insisting that we only have an interest in the truth that has been technically verified, James says that a question arises. And it is at the end of section 8, he says, the question next arises: are there not somewhere forced options in our speculative questions? And can we always wait with impunity till the coercive evidence shall have arrived? It seems a priori improbable that the truth should be so nicely adjusted to our needs and powers as that. In the great boarding house of nature, the cakes and the butter and the syrup seldom come out so even and leave the plates so clean. Indeed, we should view them with scientific suspicion if they did. And so James here is arguing that nature does not put us in a position where we can always, even in speculative matters, wait for proof that will make us feel certain we are right before settling our opinion. Moral questions will be part of what presents itself in the form of questions whose solutions cannot wait for sensible proof. Thus far, James has agreed that in the sciences it does make sense to exclude belief that is based upon insufficient evidence. But science cannot tell us about a moral truth, or about the worth or value of something. Our moral preferences are decided by the will. But how can pure intellect determine which moral preferences are valid? According to James, moral skepticism cannot be proven or refuted by logic any more than intellectual skepticism. In the meantime, Those persons who do not want there to be a moral reality will not believe in one. According to James, then, there are some truths that are dependent upon personal action. In these cases, faith based on desire becomes what he calls a lawful and possibly an indispensable thing. When we consider the nature of the religious hypothesis, these human cases of truths dependent upon action have relevance to the question of faith. Science says that things are. Morality says that some things are better than others. Religion says two things. First, it says that the best things are the more eternal things of the universe that throw the last stone or say the final word. The second statement of religion is that we are better off even now if we accept the first statement. This second statement really is the idea that the religious hypothesis is momentous. We lose a certain vital good by non-belief. This is one of the logical elements that James identified earlier, to the effect that, if he is correct, the religious option is momentous, forced, and living for us. His argument is directed at those of us for whom it is culturally a living option. He will now, in the last section, present arguments that it is forced and also momentous, in that we must choose or stand to lose by waiting for sufficient evidence to coerce our opinions. It is a forced option in that we cannot escape the issue by remaining skeptical until we have more light on it. He says we lose what is good in it if it be true. He makes the analogy of a man hesitating to ask a woman to marry him until he is perfectly sure that she will prove herself an angel. What if she then marries someone else? Skepticism then turns out not to be an avoidance option, but the taking of a different risk. The fence-sitter is playing his stake as much as the believer. Skepticism values the fear of being in error over the hope in what may be true. It is not, in fact, a question of putting intellect over passions, but an intellect with its own passion laying down its law. And so James asks the rhetorical question of, what proof is there that dupery through hope is so much worse than dupery through fear? He is effectively arguing here that the religious hypothesis is both momentous and forced for the same set of reasons. It is momentous in that we lose something by not selecting it now, although we can select it later. It is forced in that skepticism plays its own risk game, and so we must select this risk or the other, but not both. Religion comes to us in a further way that James thinks makes a veto power over our active faith even more illogical. In our religions, the eternal is represented as having personal form, with the universe being a thou rather than a mere it. We feel an appeal of religion as made to one's own goodwill. James invokes another social analogy here, that if a man makes no advances to others, he can cut himself off from social rewards. It is the same with making the gods' acquaintance. It creates a feeling that we are doing the universe a service. If this is true in all its parts, it seems absurd to put a veto on making this willing advance. So here James is making an argument from religious experience, that we have an experience of being at one with the cosmos, if not also a feeling of community with other believers. James finishes off his lecture with an appeal to others who may disagree to respect his mental freedom and to grant themselves no right of veto. What is interesting in this short part at the end is a footnote arguing that since belief is measured by action, forbidding belief would be forbidding us to act as if that belief were true. It all hinges on action, and this allows me to easily transition into a critical section. I have stated earlier that an element of Pascal's wager was the idea that he who believes that God does not exist would be led to act as if God does not exist. We see this replicated in James, however more sophisticated it may be. He does not want to come out and say it himself, but I think he accepts between the lines that religion says a third thing, that it has a monopoly on ethics. The assumption is that doubt would indicate more than just not attending in church or putting money in the collection plate. But the skeptic is not required by anything to reverse or invert his good and evil from what the believer is told from the pulpit. Doubt does not require people to become alcoholics or molest their neighbor's children. Secular ethics often turn out to prohibit and encourage pretty much the same thing. Officially in ethics as independent of religion, James expresses here a kind of moral skepticism that admits a possibility that ethics could consist in a biologically induced system of subjective feelings that yield no objectively valid answers. However, I would argue that such a skepticism properly has secular ethics as one of its options of the possibly true. Ancient Greek ethics predated and influenced Christian ethics, and the utilitarianism of Bentham and Mill is a modern example. And so unless there is a duty to attend church, I would conclude that the religious hypothesis does not hinge on action, and that it is not forced or momentous in the way that James argues. As for the argument from religious experience, I do not dispute that such a feeling of community with the cosmos can happen, but I would argue that we can get it elsewhere if one is inclined to feel it. It can be obtained from pieces of classical music, for people who appreciate it, and from progressive rock as well, especially longer pieces by Rush. Some philosophers who accept some harmonizing of nature and the good at times make me feel it, as well as good novelists, particularly Ayn Rand. Perhaps some of us have a stronger inclination than others to feel this. Now, some religious people would respond that this is pagan, in scare quotes, but to me this is exactly the point. James, between the lines, is appealing to a feeling of submission and inferiority. He talked about doing a service to the universe. This is a value judgment baked into the premise, such that those who accept his religious experience presumption are only the people who already accept the conclusion he wants. Also, all his arguments for the idea that we lose something now by not adopting religion can be made that we lose something now by foregoing a kind of independent or autonomous man that religion wants to reduce. For these reasons, the religious option as presented here does not strike me as a forced or momentous option. Still, with that being said, I will let James's argument stand in terms of respect for his decision to choose his favored option. And I recommend The Will to Believe to anyone who would like to be challenged by a short and readable piece. So if you liked it, feel free to check out my other videos and send links to all your friends. Thanks for watching.